Hello students, I'm reading pages 220 to 239 today. Starts out on September the 18th, 1805. Captain Clark has gone ahead. No food. Our spirits very low. I knew that if I didn't get food soon, this is Seaman, by the way. I knew that if I didn't get some food soon, I wouldn't have the strength to get through the mountains. I joined Captain Clark and the hunters. We made a forced march of more than 30 miles, up and down the difficult terrain. At the end of that terrible day, we were rewarded with a view far below us of an immense green plateau. We should reach it by tomorrow, Captain Clark predicted. Early the following morning, we proceeded on. Reuben Fields caught a horse in a glade and brought it to Captain Clark. Shoot it, Captain Clark ordered. We'll eat some and leave the rest for Captain Lewis and the others. The next day, we reached the plain and came upon 3 young Nez Perce boys playing with toy bows. As soon as they saw us, they ran like antelope and hid themselves. But I found the frightened boys easily in the tall grass. Captain Clark gave them some trinkets, which helped soothe their nerves. They led us to their village with their shoulders thrown back and their bony chests stuck out like proud warriors they would one day become. The camp was filled with women, children, and old men. They explained through hand talk that their men were away on a raiding party, but they expected them back soon. Captain Clark asked for food, and we were given baskets of camas root, a bulb-like plant the men found delicious. I was famished but could not make myself eat the plant. I started sniffing around for something else to fill my belly. A couple of Indian dogs followed me as I rambled through the village, but they kept their distance because I was considerably bigger than they were, despite having lost some of my bulk crossing the mountains. The Nez Perce lodges were made of poles overlaid with bark mats. Outside the lodges were piles of camas and other roots, and I reckoned we were in a temporary camp set up to gather these roots in the nearby meadows. "You," someone called in French. "Big dog." I was surprised to hear this language. The Nez Perce who greeted us had said we were the first white men they had laid eyes on. "Over here." The words came from a very old woman sitting on a log outside a lodge. I walked over to her. "I have heard of you, big dog," she said. I was pondering how this could be when a teenage boy stepped out of her lodge into the bright sun, rubbing his eyes. He looked a bit different with clothes on, but there was no mistaking him. It was the same boy Coulter and I had discovered up on the mountain. When the boy saw me, he started jumping up and down, screaming and pointing at me. His wild gesticulating frightened me, and I was on the verge of running off, but he beat me to it, disappearing behind the lodge as fast as he had on the day we first saw him. The old woman started laughing. When she stopped, she said, "The others said my grandson couldn't have seen a big black dog during his quest for his Guayaquin. They said he must have seen a wolf, but you look more like a bear to me. I will call you Yaka, Black Bear. By showing yourself here, you have made my grandson very happy. For that, you deserve some salmon. Come with me, Yaka." I had not heard the word salmon before, but I hoped it meant food. The word Guayaquin was also new. I learned later it meant spirit guide. When the Nez Perce reach a certain age, they go to a sacred place to fast and pray until they are visited by an animal spirit who will guide them throughout their lives. I followed the old woman over to a long scaffold made of sticks. Hanging on the sticks were dozens of colossal fish, split in two lengthwise, drying in the sun. She threw one down on the ground in front of me. "Eat." I was not fond of fish, but my hunger drove me to try the orange flesh. To my relief, it had a different taste than the fish I had eaten previously, but was a far cry from buffalo, deer, and elk flesh. "You had better get used to salmon," she said. "It is all you will be eating for a long time." I did get used to it, but my taste for it was not shared by our tribe, which was a shame, as there was enough of this fish drying on the scaffolds in this one camp to feed them for several months. Halfway through my salmon, the boy returned, with an old man and a group of boys, pointing at me and shouting excitedly as he approached. The old man grinned as he watched me eat, then said something to the boy. From that day on, they called the boy Mountain Dog. He and I were to become very good friends. September the 20th, 1805. Today we found the remains of a horse Captain Clark left us. It was very agreeable. And then the guys that are reading his journal say this: more agreeable than what we had, I reckon, Coulter says. Juilliard shakes his head. It's a wonder none of us died from that root. And now we're back to Seaman's point of view. The men had gotten very sick from eating too much camas. The following morning, some of them had so much pain in their bellies they could not stand up. Captain Clark sent those who could walk out hunting, except for Reuben Fields. He was sent back toward the mountains to find Captain Lewis with a load of dried salmon and camas root the Nez Perce provided. Make sure you tell them to go easy on that root, Captain Clark said. Yes, sir, Reuben said. While the men were out hunting, Captain Clark rambled over to another camp along the river, where it was said their chief, a man named Twisted Hair, was fishing. I did not go with Captain Clark, nor did I join Reuben or the men hunting. Instead, I stayed in camp with Mountain Dog, following him around as he proudly showed me off to his friends. I had never been around a young boy and found it very much to my liking. He and his friends were filled with enormous energy and a boundless sense of fun. They were constantly laughing, racing their horses, and playing jokes on one another. It brought to mind the fun we'd had before we started up the Missouri. Mountain Dog lived with 3 other boys his age in a lodge not far from his grandmother, whose name, I learned, was Watquees, meaning returned from a faraway country. That night I learned how she had gotten this name. Mountain Dog and his friends were gathered around Watquees' fire exchanging stories. When they had exhausted their supply, one of the boys asked Watquees to tell her story. But you know my story, she said. Please? Watquees looked deep into the fire and began. When I was a young girl, I traveled east of the mountains with my family to hunt the buffalo. We had been there for some time gathering and preparing the meat and the skins, and we were ready to come home. But on the day we were to leave, the Blackfeet fell upon us. They killed everyone in my family and took me with them. I lived as a slave in their village for a long time, a long and terrible time. The Blackfeet are as cruel as every story you have heard about them. The only thing that kept me alive was the thought that I would one day escape and return here. After a time, the man who owned me took me north for many days. We arrived at a huge lodge made of trees stacked together, higher than one can climb. The lodge was called a fort. The men who lived inside had white skin and hair on their faces and chests, like the men who have come to visit us here. They trapped and traded furs, and their ways were very different from ours. The Blackfeet who owned me traded me to a white man for a musket. At first I was very frightened, but the white man who bought me was a good man. He treated me well. We lived together for many years, and I bore him a son. But still I dreamed of returning home. When our son was still small, I was told by a white woman living at the fort that the men were going back to their home across the big water. They are never coming back, she said, and they are taking you with them. Of all the bad things that had happened to me, this would have been the most terrible, because it would have meant I could never see my home again. The white woman helped me to escape. She gave me a hatchet and some food. One night as the men slept, I put my son in a cradle board and left the fort. I went east toward the mountains. Suns and storms beat me down. Wild animals chased me. Streams and rivers barred my way. I was constantly afraid the Blackfeet would find me, but I continued on. Whenever I was too afraid to take another step, my Waiakan, a great wolf, encouraged me to continue and told me which way to go. I made a raft to cross a big river. As I crossed, a bear attacked me, but I killed him with my hatchet. My baby began to weaken because we had no food. I found a pile of old bones that still had some meat on them. I cooked this meat and fed some to my baby, but the meat was bad. My baby died. I dug a shallow grave with my hands and buried him. When I finally reached the mountains, my strength left me. I lay there for many days waiting for death. But instead, a group of Nimipu warriors found me and took me across the mountains to my home. September 22nd, 1805. Private R. Fields found us today and brought camas root and salmon. These mountains will soon be behind us. Coulter stands and stretches. We're getting toward the end, but I've had about enough for tonight. What do you mean, we're toward the end? Juilliard asks in surprise. The end of the Red Book. The captain doesn't make another entry until January the 1st, 1806, when we were at Fort Clatsop. Juilliard takes the book and flips through the few remaining pages. Guess we can finish it up tomorrow then, he explains this to Watkuis. Mountain Dog puts the Red Book into the pouch, and he and Watkuis walk back to their teepee. Coulter rolls his blanket out next to the fire. They got most of them buffalo hides cleaned up this afternoon. I suspect they'll be moving on soon. You think Twisted Hair will be back tomorrow? Or the next day, Juilliard says. Funny, the captain didn't write much after we got over them mountains. He wasn't the same after that. The evening is warm and clear and windy. I feel restless and ramble out onto the prairie where the yellow moon is so bright the buffalo cast shadows on the ground. I think about Captain Lewis and the men during that final year. Coulter is right. The captain was not the same after crossing the mountains. But neither were the other men, and neither was I. I find a sheltered place among some rocks and lie down. A great deal happened during the months the captain chose not to write in the Red Book. I close my eyes and remember. When Captain Lewis and the other men arrived at the Camas camp, they looked more dead than alive. Cheeks sunken, buckskins filthy and torn, moccasins shredded, and they barely had the strength to pull the packs off their thin horses. The captain lay down outside a lodge, clutched his knees, and began to moan. He wasn't alone. I told them to take it easy on that camas and fish, Reuben said, but they were so hungry they couldn't help themselves. Birdwoman Pomp and old Toby were not afflicted. In fact, when Birdwoman saw me, she smiled broadly, scratched my ears, then reached into her pouch and gave me a dead mouse. The Nez Perce gathered round us as the men unloaded the horses. They were astonished at the collection of goods, but what impressed them most were the rifles. That night, the Nez Perce men met at the lodge next door to Watkuis. They talked for hours about our tribe and our goods. If we had those rifles, we could protect ourselves from our enemies. We could kill deer and elk in the winter when the salmon is gone. Did you see the metal tomahawk for cutting trees? With that, we could build shelters and cut wood for our fires in no time at all. Watkuis sat outside her lodge, pounding camas root on a flat stone, listening to their conversation. The white men are very sick, one of the men said. Even their chiefs are weakened, another added. It would be easy to have these things for ourselves. Watkuis got up and walked over to them. I hear your talk, she said. The white men were very good to me, even though I was a stranger to them. We are just talking, Watkuis. There is no harm in talk. Bad talk leads to bad actions. You talk like the Blackfeet. The men stared at the fire, chastened. These men have done nothing to you, she said. Do them no harm. And they didn't. Instead, they were very kind to our tribe. We moved our camp to the Clearwater River. Captain Clark had the men who felt well enough cut trees for dugout canoes. The Nez Perce showed them an easier way to hollow out the logs by using hot coals from the fire. Chief Twisted Hair said he would care for our horses and saddles while we were gone in exchange for 2 rifles. He helped us brand the horses so we would know which ones were ours when we returned. Every day, people from different villages came to camp with food to sell. In the evenings, Captain Clark treated the Nez Perce ills in exchange for horses and other items. We stayed with the Nez Perce for several weeks, preparing for the last leg of our journey to the Pacific Ocean. During most of that time, Captain Lewis was so sick he could not sit up. I stayed with him most nights, but during the day I spent my time with Mountain Dog and his friends, who had built a shelter close to the canoe camp, so they would not miss any of the excitement of having us there. They took me hunting with bows and arrows, although we rarely saw any game. Hunting was just an excuse to get on horseback and race each other to the top of hills. They took me upriver where they speared salmon, which were more numerous than the buffalo east of the mountains. In some spots, the fish were so thick you could have crossed the river on their fins. They took me up into the mountains, a place Mountain Dog knew very well, and with him I lost my fear of the mountain's bite. And there I discovered something. Mountain Dog and his friends were on foot tracking a deer up a draw when I heard caw, caw, caw. I had not seen Whitefeather since Traveler's Rest. He was perched in a lightning-struck tree. I stopped and barked. He's scaring the deer. Mountain Dog ignored his friend's complaint and looked up at the tree. What's he looking at? He asked. I stared at Mountain Dog. Surely he and his friends could see and hear Whitefeather. Perhaps he sees his spirit guide, one of his friends said, laughing. A dog with a spirit guide? The other scoffed. Caw, caw, caw. I was bewildered. How could they not see and hear Whitefeather? Mountain Dog and his friends continued up the draw after the deer, but I stayed below the tree staring up at my companion, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. I thought back to all of the other times Whitefeather had appeared, trying to remember if my human companions had ever acknowledged his presence. If they had, I couldn't recall it. It would be some time before I discovered what this meant. The men began complaining about having nothing to eat except salmon and camas root. They killed a horse to eat, but this did not slake their appetite. One day I returned to camp from the ramble upriver with Mountain Dog. I smelled meat roasting, but it was not horse or any other animal flesh I had smelled before. I hurried along, and when I got there, I found the men standing around the fires, pushing meat into their mouths. Captain Lewis was with them, and so was Bird Woman. She had Pomp in her lap and was feeding him little pieces she had pulled off a bone. I believe this is the most delicious meat I've ever eaten, the captain said between mouthfuls. It is far superior to either deer or elk, and it is certainly better than horse. Several Nez Perce stood off to the side. They were trying to hide their smiles and whispering to each other as they watched the men eat. I walked up to the captain, happy to see he was feeling better, and hoping he might part with a morsel or two. You've been out with those Indian boys again, he said, seeing my wet fur. Don't forget whose dog you are. Try this. He tossed a meaty bone about 20 feet away from me. I ran over to it, and I was about to try this new food for myself when Sergeant Pryor came into camp, pulling a whimpering Indian dog behind him with a rope. He cinched the poor dog to the stump, pulled his knife out, and slit the dog's throat. I stared in disbelief, too horrified to even bark. I looked at the men. They continued talking and didn't even glance in the dog's direction as he bled out. When the dog stopped struggling, Reuben untied the rope and gutted him like a deer. I looked down at the bone. I looked at the meat roasting above the fire. I looked at the Nez Perce still smiling and whispering. The Nez Perce did not eat dog. In fact, the very idea disgusted them. But this did not stop them from selling every dog they could get their hands on to our tribe. I left the canoe camp and did not return that night or the next. I had never been so sorry to leave a place in my life as I was when we left the Nez Perce. Mountain Dog stood on the bank with Wacquees and waved to me with tears in his eyes as the Clearwater River pushed us westward to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time in our journey, we floated with the current instead of struggling against it, which presented new challenges and no small amount of fear, especially among the men who could not swim. Instead of portaging around the rapids, we took our dugouts down the center of these chaotic flows, which at times scared everyone, including me. Old Toby, who had decided to travel downriver with us a ways, spent the first evening around the fire removing splinters from his hands, buried there by gripping the sides of the canoe. By the second evening, he'd had all he could take. He left without claiming the 2 horses the captain promised him for guiding us through the mountains. After old Toby left, Twisted Hair and another chief joined us and rode in the lead canoe to tell the Indians downriver we were coming and we were friendly. Wood for our campfires was as scarce as game along the river. We proceeded down the Clearwater onto the Snake River, stopping every night to buy wood from the Indians and dogs to cook over the fire. The captains did not want to take the time to send men out hunting for any other meat. The only thing on their minds was to get to the Pacific Ocean as fast as the current would take us. Not wanting to eat dog, I spent a good portion of my evening scrounging for food among the Indians. When we reached the broad Columbia River, we met the Chinook Indians. They crowded around our camp every night, more curious about our goods than they were about us. Little items started to disappear from our supplies. A tomahawk, a spoon, which made the men very angry, but none more than Captain Lewis, who treated the Chinooks very roughly for stealing our things. Once again, he had been overtaken by one of his dark moods, but this time he was not alone. In their hurry to reach the Pacific, all of the men seemed to have lost their patience with the Indians. The men's mood was not improved when Twisted Hair told us that he had heard the Indians below intended to kill us and take our goods. The Indians below did not try to kill us. They thought the water would take care of that for them. Below Celio Falls, where Twisted Hair and the other chiefs said their goodbyes and headed back upriver, was a narrow chute of raging water. Rather than portage around it, the captains decided to float right down the center of it, against the advice of several Chinooks who said that not even they would attempt such a feat. Those who could not swim were put on shore with the captain's papers, instruments, and other valuable items. "See you on the other side," Captain Lewis shouted up to them. It was a wild ride, but all of our canoes made it through unscathed, much to the disappointment of some of the Indians waiting below. I think I will stop there for this evening and record the rest tomorrow. I think I was going to do a little bit more when I first started out, but we're going to stop instead on page 237. One thing that might be interesting to you is to look on the map, which I've included on the class page. The Clearwater River that they were camped nearby is in northern Idaho. It's pretty close to Lewiston, Idaho. And when it joins up with the Snake, that is at Lewiston, Idaho. So I think it would be really interesting for you to take a look at where the Nez Perce Indians are. I'll be back again for another recording tomorrow. See ya.